Hey, first graders. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what we're learning for our newest IB planner, and that is fairy tales. So we are going to be reading through several fairy tales over the next couple of weeks, and then there are some elements in those fairy tales that make it unique and make it a fairy tale. So some of those things that you might see in a fairy tale are written on this poster back here, so we'll look through some of these together. So one of the things that you might notice is that good versus evil. So if there's a good character and a bad character. We notice royalty, kings, queens, princesses, sometimes poverty, so people who don't have as much money or are poor. There's magic and castles. There's a problem, and then usually they solve the problem. And one of my favorite parts about solving the problem is this part, that usually there's a happy ending. We talked a little bit last week about personification, that those bears in the story are wearing clothes, they're talking, they live in a house. The author has given an animal a human-like characteristic, and that's called personification. We talked a little bit too about groups of three. So we read last week the three Goldilocks and the three bears. So that was one example. They start with once upon a time. They're usually set in the past, so they might start with a long time ago, long, long ago. So in the past means a long time ago, things that have already happened. They're typically make-believe. There's elves, dwarves, giants, wizards. And this is a really important part about fairy tales is they teach us a lesson or they teach us a value. So there's always a meaning, a special message in that video or in that story that you're going to learn after you hear the story. So sometimes we'll pull out that author's purpose or that author's message after we read, and we'll see what the author was really trying to teach us. So today we're going to read a story together again, and then we will look back at some of those elements in the fairy tale, and also we'll see if the story has a special message that it's trying to teach us. So here's our story for this week. This is Little Red Riding Hood. I am sure that many of you have heard this story before. This is a very popular one. And this is a story that has been told for many years. So many fairy tales have been told for years and years and years. And so a lot of times they get retold and they change things maybe just a little bit. So we'll notice in this story if there's any changes from what the original Little Red Riding Hood story is like. And we'll see if anything is the same or if they've made any changes, and we'll look for some of those fairy tale elements. Here we go. Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood. There once lived a girl named Little Red Riding Hood. Everyone called her Red. One day, Red's mom asked her to take some cake to Grandma. Go quickly through the woods and do not talk to strangers, Mom said. In the woods, though, Red met Wolf. Where are you going, child? Wolf asked. I'm taking cake to Grandma's house, she said. Wolf looked at Red and licked his lips. Wonder what he's thinking. He decided he would eat Grandma for lunch and Red for dessert. Where does Grandma live? Wolf asked. Farther on in the woods, under the 3 large oak trees, Red said. Wouldn't your grandma like some pretty flowers? Wolf suggested. Red bent down to pick up some flowers. While she picked, Wolf ran straight to Grandma's house. He went to Grandma's bed and swallowed her whole. He dressed himself in her clothes and pulled on her cap. Then he laid himself in her bed. Oh no, he swallowed her whole. When Red arrived, she went to the bed. Grandma, what big ears you have, Red said. All the better to hear you with, child, Wolf said. Grandma, what big eyes you have, Red said. All the better to see you with, child, Wolf said. Oh, Grandma, what a big mouth you have, Red said. All the better to eat you with, Wolf roared. Then he swallowed up Red, flowers, cake, and all. Wolf lay down again in the bed and fell asleep. Inside the wolf's stomach, it was dark and crowded. Inch by inch, Red lifted her clump of flowers and tickled Wolf's throat until he coughed her up. Red grabbed onto Grandma's hand and pulled her out too. Wolf was still asleep. They tied him to Grandma's bed. Then Grandma and Red sat down for tea and cake. When Wolf awoke, you can be sure he didn't get any. This is a glossary at the end of the story with some of those trickier words like awoke and clump, roared. And that's the end of that story. So let's look through the story now. I did notice that this story had a little bit of a different ending than some of the other versions of Little Red Riding Hood that I have heard. There are some stories where a hunter comes along and rescues Red Riding Hood and the grandmother that way. The hunter saves them. So in this story, I thought it was interesting that they tickled his throat and then he coughed and they came out and they were safe and sound. I want to look for some personification in this story. So when the wolf can talk and when the wolf can act like a human, that's showing personification. So anytime that an author decides to make an animal act like a human, then that's showing personification. This one is a little bit different because he's not wearing clothes and he doesn't live in a house. He lives in the woods. So they've just added a little bit of personification to the wolf by letting him be able to talk. So that's a human-like characteristic that he has. Some other things that I'm noticing from the poster is there was a problem and a solution. So the problem was that Little Red Riding Hood told the wolf where Grandma lived. And the kind of message in the story was that her mom told her not to talk to strangers. On the very first page when it says, go quickly through the woods and do not talk to strangers. And did Little Red Riding Hood listen to her mother? She did not. As soon as the wolf spoke to her, she spoke right back to him. And so she did not listen to her mother. So that could be the lesson or the value in the story here, is that you should listen to your parents, or that you shouldn't talk to strangers, or that if somebody tells you something, you should listen and pay attention. Okay, so that could be the message for this story. Was there a happy ending in this story? There was, yes. The wolf was just sleeping and the grandma and the Little Red Riding Hood were able to stay safe and eat their cake, and it was all a happy ending. There wasn't really any elves or dwarves or giant in this story, but we did have a talking wolf and no castles or royalty, but kind of a good versus evil, because we had the big bad wolf and then we had the good characters being Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. So that's our story for this week for our fairy tales. As you read a story this week, you're going to read the story about a gingerbread girl. And as you read that story next, as you listen to that story, listen for some of these elements in a fairy tale. See if there's any personification. Is the gingerbread girl being characterized as a human? Does she have human-like things happening to her, even though she's just a gingerbread cookie? So be listening for some of those things as you continue reading fairy tales this next week and see what you can notice. Bye, you guys. Have a great day.